Welcome, Andy Pancholi, to our interview on behalf of the Foundational Study of Cycles. It's great to actually have a fireside chat with a lifetime friend and colleague. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, Ron. It's good to be here.
So we have plenty to discuss in the time that we have. Most notably, your very successful presentation at our last market forecast event, January past 2022, just to timestamp that. And your main focus was, of course, the specialization of cycles that you have developed over the years within world affairs and specifically geopolitical events. And boy, has there been a whole lot of event risk, elevated volatility in the markets in general, and lots of uncertainty still with us. Please share a few points with our foundation members and just cycle enthusiasts out there that are trying to better understand this world. What were the key insights of what you shared? What passed? And what can you say now, 6 months later?
Okay, well, thank you, Ron. Let's just recap back in January. I think the first week of January, when we had a summit, then we looked at various bits and pieces, and I presented the case for the geopolitical background to 2022, which really has seen these war cycles coming together based on super macro cycles, basically, of geopolitical conflict. So we've seen Putin's special operations in Ukraine, and what we did do back in January, and people may wish to review that presentation, but we looked at these disruptive cycles, and typically these are 82 to 84 year cycles. And what we were saying and what we were forewarning people about was, if you go back to the outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, and add 82 to 84 years, we get this window of 2021 to 2024. So further background to it, I call it a disruptive cycle. It's a revolutionary cycle. And some of the other work that I've put on here, we talked about how revolutions were playing out with Brexit, Trump being a slightly different leader, and you can relate that back to dissatisfaction cycles in Germany in the early 1930s. Take that a further cycle back, we saw the revolutions across Europe led by Karl Marx in 1848 when he published the Communist Manifesto, and you can take that a further revolution back to 1765 and the Stamp Act, which really precipitated the American Revolution. So what was the common factor in all these things, and why did they appear almost by clockwork? Well, the common factor was the masses were dissatisfied. They were dissatisfied with the status quo. In the case of the Stamp Act, the American Revolution, the settlers were fed up with the actions of the British demanding more and more taxes. In the case of Karl Marx, it was all about the Industrial Revolution and the industrialists taking the agrarian society off the fields and bringing them into factories, and then exploiting them for huge hours, paying them a pittance. And then, it's a little bit like what's going on right now. And then, you move that forward. What happened? Germany was faced with reparations after the Great War, after the First World War. So we've got this disruptive cycle, and then we came forward all the way through to, Brexit's a really good example. People got fed up with the European Union, and within that, other cycles were coming together. So Britain voted to leave the European Union. In America, there was a need and desire for change as Trump came and stood for election and won that. That was a big change compared to what we'd seen in the preceding administrations. So in every one of these cases, there is some human psychology that goes on that creates this sort of this pattern of disruption. So coming back to the war cycles, as I say, we go back one war cycle using this 82 to 84 year pattern, and then we can go back, and that took us to the outbreak of World War II, but we can go back a further cycle, and that will take us into the Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. And again, in that case, we saw four nations fighting it all out. There's a couple of interesting things, more than a couple of interesting things that come with this, is that we see the Ottoman Empire, the British, the French, basically at war with Russia. So 2 cycles back, there's this Russian thing, but very specifically, it's in the Crimean Peninsula, the very same geographical region that conflict is taking place in right now. So, Crimea is just south of the Ukraine. We're back there. And so, you've got to put it into context. These were the superpowers of the time, the Ottoman Empire being the Turkish nation. So this is how history is repeating or rhyming. And basically what happened there, well, Russia did lose that conflict. But, let's go into context of back to how we looked and predicted the scenario that's breaking out.
Well, on that point, Andy, you hit a very important question that would be great to differentiate for our audience. This idea about cycles in general, the whole concept of cycles even occurring, but also as to whether it's a pattern that repeats in history or rhymes. What can you share with us for those of us that are trying to rationalize? We're listening to how we're listening and experiencing the patterns at play. There's no doubt that there is this coincidental or correlation pattern that continues throughout time. We're going back tens, decades, hundreds of years. And then on that point, for the wider audience who may be new to cycles or maybe still trying to bridge the understanding, what would you say about how cycles happen and whether it's a repetition or a rhyme of history?
Well, it's both repetition and it's a really good question, Ron. And I don't know the true answer to it, but I've been a student of it for, approaching 40 years now. So, I continue to live and learn. But what we do see is this dance of patterns and waves. I mean, the first thing we must understand that there is no, nature abhors a vacuum, and it abhors anything that's static. So everything is in movement and vibration. Even if you go into atomic structure, everything's vibrating. So we've got this degree of wave movement, and whether it's a nanosecond all the way through to a millennium or much, much larger space of time, that's exactly, we get these waves coming and going, and therefore arguably you can compare crests of waves and troughs of waves and so on, and you might get a degree of a sort of recurrence of event. So we have to ask ourselves, what's all this about? So and in the shorter term cycles, it's very easy to say, well, it's basically human psychology and repetition of human behavior based on a generational cycle, because a generation often repeats the same mistakes. As we're growing up, when we get to teenage years, we all want to discover our own independence, and we're going to start arguing with our parents, etc., and all that sort of thing. So, in that way, there's a set pattern of just growth and evolution. But when we come back to, history and cycles, well, let's just focus in a little bit more on this. So if we take a revolution as, a generation as being, say, 18 to 20 years, then typically, every 3 generations, we're going to get to a point where you're not going to see the same information handed down. So what I'm really saying here is that, one generation, the parents will say, told you so, or whatever, or actually more positively, this is really what you want to learn. 2 generations, you might relate to your grandparents. But at the 3rd generation, there probably isn't going to be that, there aren't probably going to be that many people that can mentor you in life cycles, as it were. And this, the same occurs in history and politics. So, every 60 years, we see a bigger event because things get pushed. And that's what we're seeing right now. So, I mean, forget the numbers, but we have basically been in times of peace for a very long time. Okay. We have also seen the biggest bull market. Some of you watching this presentation might well be in your 20s or 30s, and you've probably known nothing but a bull market since 2009. So, things change. Now, I'm sort of going a little bit off piste and rambling here, but the point I want to make is that every 3 generations, you get the bigger events. So 60 years, for example, 60 years plus, because people will push things into a point because they've never experienced it. So the elders who have lived through wars will generally talk out politicians of going into war, into significant war, because they've lived through it and they've experienced the personal consequences of bombing, loss, personal loss of property, people, the hardship, and the emotional, stress of it all. But there comes a point where nobody's actually lived through it, so they don't have that within them, and they're not prepared to listen to those who are in their 80s or 90s or whatever. So, a classic example of a 60-year cycle in history is that 1941 Pearl Harbor and 2001 the attacks on 9/11. They're the only two times that America's been attacked on its own soil. And I'm going to use this to come back into the war cycles idea, because years ending in one typically do see a degree of conflict. So what the point I'm going to make here is that we'll look at these 10-year cycles, and I'll just run through them quickly. And we got this super 82 to 84-year cycle coming in from the First World War and the Crimean War. And you can actually go back a further cycle and you'll see other conflicts there. So what we've got is the big pattern being triggered by a smaller harmonic of 10 years. So 41, effectively we've got America entering the Second World War after Pearl Harbor. 51, the Korean War. 61 was the Bay of Pigs, leading into 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now watch that space. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. If you go 71, you've got India-Pakistan, significant event, big war there, as well as lots of stuff in the Middle East. 81, Britain was involved in the Falklands crisis. 91, basically 1991, saw Saddam Hussein go into Kuwait, and we had Operation Desert Storm, Gulf War I. And then 2001, we got basically the second Gulf War after 9/11. Moving forward, to 2011 was the intervention in Libya. So here we go, move forward another, 10 years, 2021 to 2022. This is the 10-year trigger cycle acting with the 82 to 84-year cycle. That's the key point I want to make. So you're asking about cycles, and these are the harmonics, but we can take this a stage further, because back in December 1991 was really that was when Ukraine effectively became independent. So the 30-year cycle being half of the 60-year cycle, this triggered the breakup, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The USSR took place 30 years ago. And so it was really this idea that we get this pattern every 30 years, and it's a very prevalent cycle in commodity markets as well, that the 30-year cycle also triggers this event, saying, well, the spotlight's back on the breakup of the Soviet Union. And sure enough, if you look at things from Putin's point of view, he will argue, well, NATO did not stick to their side of the deal. They encroached all the territory they said they wouldn't. So he sees it fair that he should regain the territories that they were seen as theirs. And of course, in the West, we see it as an aggressive act, etc. So this is the point of how you've got a 30-year cycle, a 10-year trigger cycle, all tying in with this super long-term 82 to 84-year cycle. Does that make sense, Ron, there?
It does, and it really aligns with, our founder of the foundation, Edward Dewey, with his original invitation to research cycles in general and understand why the Great Depression took place. And so, as we know, the president of that day asked him to begin that search. It became a lifetime endeavor. And the more recent research that we published on the website, the case for cycles, is ultimately a case not just for cycles in markets, world affairs, nature, but also the harmonics of things, as you touched, as cycles confluence with each other and ebb and flow, like you say, in terms of waves. Perhaps that makes it a difficult question for us to rationalize in terms of whether it's a historical rhyme or repetition. As a segue on that point, Andy, what would you say about the fate versus free will? So we've identified these patterns, they exist, and you've just given a wonderful demonstration of the 100-year disruption cycle and how that tied in with the 10-year and the first year of each decade in terms of some of the social tensions, civil unrest, and the wars. Is it always inevitable? And if so, why? What can you say maybe to your experience of the patterns and how they play out throughout history, but also into the future?
Well, a whole series of questions, and there's a point I want to pick up on. In fact, let me pick up on that straight away. So we talked about the Depression, and I'm going to answer your question, and this all ties up together. So we talked about why the foundation was set up to see if the Great Depression could have been prevented. Now, we talked about 30-year patterns. We've talked about 60-year patterns. The next one in that cycle is a 90-year pattern. So we are 90 years on from that. In fact, as we are recording this today on the 24th of June, as I can't be with you live, today is the 90-year anniversary of the stock market low following the 29 crash. Okay. So that, we should, potentially, digressing a little bit, and, we can judge this accordingly when you see this in a couple of weeks' time. We might well be in the window for a low on the markets right now. So but what are we seeing? We are seeing a downturn in economic conditions as we saw 90 years ago. The 1929 crash took place in September, 3rd of September 1929. The 2020 top was only was only weeks, was that on the 15th of February, wasn't it? So, we're in the tolerance of less than 3 months, only weeks on a 90-year cycle. So you can see these patterns playing out. And we have got an economic downturn. We've had 13 years of bull market economics, and stock market history. So the question was fate versus free will. So absolutely, this is a question that I answer. If your task is to cross a minefield, okay, so if you stand on a mine, you're going to do a lot of damage to yourself, or worse. There's fate versus free will. Now, if you knew where you could do it with a map or without a map, and if you do it without a map, you basically, it's like saying you don't have the map. The map is effectively cycles. Okay, so if you understand, if you have a map of the minefield, you can then navigate around the mines and get across it successfully. But free will, even with a map, should you be so inclined, you could still step on a mine. Okay, so it could still be pretty nasty. I know this is a bit of a negative example, but this is the point. Cycles give us a roadmap. How you choose to interpret that is another thing. So, you can, the masses, the general masses do not know what's going on, and they become victims to a reactive situation that's going on. So, you see, well, Bitcoin and the crypto market's a tremendous example. How many people have lost their shirts in the last few weeks and months because they don't see the cycles within these things. We talked about how Bitcoin was really part of the 100-year cycle going 300 years back to the boom and busts from 1720, the Mississippi land crisis, the South Sea bubble. That's where we got the first boom. So in terms of fate and free will, if you understand cycles and you choose to harness them, then you can effectively be not so much immune, but you can be well protected. But equally, you can fall prey to the cycles if you don't follow them or understand them or try to follow them. And, one of the things is that one of the groups of people that I speak to have been very busy prepping, for the last 18 months to 2 years. They can see they foresaw the food shortages. We talked about the grain cycles. That's another one. That's another big 100-year cycle and 50-year cycle, especially in wheat. So that they're taking action because they can see what's coming up next. So the real answer is that it's up to you. It's all about consciousness and behavior, and this is a whole different discussion. Consciousness and your belief systems, and but all these things fall into cycles and patterns as well. So does that answer your question there, Ron?
It does well, and of course it's a whole discussion in its own right. But a popular question that gets asked when people are mostly rationalizing, but then also asking the question, how much influence do we have if the cycle's set and inevitable? But as you say, those who can be aware of the cyclicality of life, world affairs, markets, we can at least be, raise our conscious awareness on that understanding that things are not linear, they are cyclical, and that a knowledge of that cycle can help us better prepare. And maybe one of the examples I tend to go through, like the seasons of the year: spring, summer, autumn, winter.
Absolutely,
we're fully aware of that of that sequential pattern.
Let me drill down on that, Ron. So absolutely, there's a time to sort of plant, time to grow, time to harvest, and then a time to rejuvenate, effectively death and rebirth. And that's what goes on. And in fact, this is what we see in markets, in bull markets, isn't it? Because, we'll see an accumulation phase, then a bull market, and then a harvesting point of distribution, and then, a bear market. So we see this. And what I say to people is that, well, first of all, these follow mathematical patterns. Generally, there's an 18-year cycle, and these things are a 30-year cycle. And of course, the cycles overlap and intertwine, so they're not very easy to see at times. But a market gives us something really clear. When we get let's just look at a daily bar on a market. So, we get an open, a low, a high, and a close. And if the market opened and popped down to start with in the morning, and then headed up, and then made a really nice high mid-afternoon, and then closed higher than it opened, it was generally a positive day. It was an up day. Now, markets enable us to identify cycles because they're mathematically derived, in terms of the price, and we have history. But if I said to you, Ron, what happened to you, or any of you watching, if I said to you, what happened to you on, say, let's pick a day, 14th of September 2003, okay? Most of you will say, I don't really know. And unless something big, unless a life-changing event happened, there was a birth, a death, or a marriage, or something like that, then you won't remember what happened. But the key point is that every day we wake up and you think, okay, well, how's the day going? And you might have a great day. So you might wake up feeling, yeah, I don't feel too bad. You have a great day. You go and work with Ron William, and you have a fabulous day, and the day keeps getting better and better, and you close feeling, what a great day. That's an up bar for you, right? But another day you might wake up, you think, oh, I feel a bit groggy, I've got a bit of a headache, I've got all this work to do, I'm not very excited about it, etc., etc. And but you get some of it done, you felt a bit bad, now you feel better, and you close at the same level you started the day. That's a flat bar, isn't it? Other days you might wake up. So you can actually plot your life day by day effectively by your own sentiment. Now, it's a subjective call, but the point is that you will have trends of up moves and down moves and within your life. So and it'll be in different sectors of your life, as it were, to use, sorry, sound very financial using sectors. It'll be in different arenas of your life. So it might be your career, you're doing well in your career, maybe you changed career, it wasn't quite, or job or whatever, it wasn't quite what you expected. So you've got this up move, a pull back, it's like Elliott Wave. Same in relationships, you meet somebody, it's all going really well, etc. Then you settle down, it settles down a bit, then it gets better, and then maybe some relationships don't work out, maybe some do. So can you see how these are all moving in cycles and patterns? And actually, I take this a stage further, because we talk, as you know, we talk heavily at the FSC about the 10-year decennial pattern in markets, and this overlay idea that, we tend to see big bull markets in years ending in 5 and years ending in 7 tend to pull back, apart from the year 2017. I think 11 of the last 12 have all been have seen bear markets. But you can do the same in your own life. You can do a decennial overlay, and you will see fascinating patterns. Oh, look, I moved house then. Oh, 10 years ago, this one. Oh, I had a bit of an illness issue here, etc. And actually, you can do a 10-year overlay, but you can also do a 20-year overlay. And that's where the key to some of the forecasting lies, is the 20-year cycle, which is also very prevalent in commodities. So you can overlay and see highs and lows repeating at those sorts of intervals just by overlaying those charts.
And by doing that, of course, we can be more empowered in terms of the awareness and use of cycles, and perhaps, as I've heard some people describe, connect the microcosm with the macrocosm, and try and just find our position in the world, as it were, which is always a good thing. I'm also thinking, in terms of your point about how cycles fit within markets. Fund manager Howard Marks of Oaktree Capital published in his recent memo this idea of why do cycles work in markets, the excess and corrections. And of course, he published a book years ago on mastering the cycle. There's more awareness now, Andy, it seems, about the subject of cycles across different fields. There always was, awareness, particularly when the foundation was formed by economists and scientists. But where do you think the subject is right now in terms of general acceptance, awareness, and people actually using it in an intelligent way?
Well, several things. The Howard Marks book, which I think is just there behind me there, is a great book. Ray Dalio has published his book. David Murren has done some excellent work on this. So the awareness of cycles is definitely rising. Remember that everything is all about hope, fear, and greed, really, be it markets, life, or whatever. So these three emotions are the key triggers. And what will tend to happen is that as we see a downturn, as we're seeing right now in the markets, people look for reasons for, there's a saying, isn't there? Don't confuse brains with the bull market, right? So if you got on the train at the right point, then you were lucky. But if you then took a big hit, as I said, we've already talked about the crypto arena, which we're looking at some significant pullbacks in the stock markets right now as well. People are suddenly thinking, why did I lose that money? I was told, my broker told me the markets only ever go up. Real estate only ever goes up. And as we know, people like Phil Anderson, who's a good friend of ours, he's very clearly highlighted this 18.6 years cycle in real estate that works like clockwork. So why are we getting an interest in cycles, an increased interest in cycles? Very simply because the crypto people have just got burnt. The stock market public are now seeing a downturn, which they haven't seen the likes of realistically. There was a bit of a blip in 2020. There were a couple of other blips, but there hasn't been a serious correction since the global financial crisis, 2007 to 2009. So when people start losing money, i.e. it's fear, right? So hope was there all the way up as the market went up. Then we got into fear when it turned down, and greed sort of sits along. When hope transitions to fear, people look for reasons, and that's where cycles sort of start getting a bit more interesting, saying, if only I knew that. So you're ready for the next cycle, be it in 18 years time or 20 years time or whatever.
Well, one thing I heard, Andy, just recently was a wonderful kind of switch of the acronym FOMO, fear, but fear of missing out, which was at record extremes post-pandemic crash into this strongest bull market recovery, I think, in history. Last year, for example, linear bull market with less than a 5% correction. Buy on the dip worked 7 consecutive times. I mean, I don't want to say it was an easy market, but it was a good market, and people did make money for the most part. But apparently, fear of missing out, FOMO, F-O-M-O, has turned to FOLO, fear of losing out, where people want to protect their profits, capital preserve and de-risk. And as you say, to unfortunately, and maybe just through the nature of markets, show itself, and hence it's during those times that the people start reevaluating their market strategy, their general mindset and behavioral points of view. And so we shift from a linear thinking to a cyclical one, and maybe try and ask questions as to why and how can we learn more.
Well, I think this is a good question, because the argument is that some thinking is blinkered, i.e. it's linear, and if you widen your field of vision, you'll see something a bit more, won't you? And I think that's really what cycles are about. They're effectively, I explain to my clients that the use of cycles is effectively the use of night vision goggles. Great
analogy.
Yeah, everybody says, oh, nobody could have foreseen this conflict, and the disruption it's created. Well, if you can see the cycle coming up and you sit down with your think tank, with your inner circle, the guys that I have around me, then you think, well, if scenario A occurs, what are going to be the ramifications for A, B, C? And one of those A, B's and C's is the markets. And then which commodities, for example, are going to be at risk or whatever. And then there's no such thing as a black swan, basically. It's just a cycle that's been missed. So, people said, oh, well, you see, if we go back to 1970s, the early 70s, we got massive booms in grain markets. Why? Because we had a Russian famine. Okay, so that was a supply problem. Then suddenly there was a ban on exports. Then we had the currency crisis with the breakdown with Nixon and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement with the dollar devaluations, etc. And they said, oh, it was a triple whammy. Well, here we are 50 years on, pretty much to the week, to the month. That's, people have been following the work. We got the low to within a week, based on this 50-year cycle, i.e. half the 100-year cycle. But, nobody could have foreseen the exaggeration and the blow-off moves in the markets, given, in the wheat market because of Ukraine. Well, this is what was all coming together. So you see these things lying out. You've got to think them through and think of possible scenarios. And we're not always right. But, if you've thought it through, you're ahead of most of the pack. And I think that's really what it's about. When you see these cycles coming together, one of the things I'm looking at the moment really is some degree of breakdown and a further polarization of the United States, and I think that's going to escalate over the next 3 to 4 years. And so, what are the ramifications of that going to be? Is that going to, what's impacts is that going to have on the dollar, etc.? So this idea of like thinking ahead, what lies ahead, is really quite critical.
Great point, and music to my ears, Andy. Particularly the subject of scenario planning, which is an area that I'm focusing on quite a bit. Which actually has been developed, I think, over the decades. Originally in the energy business, when they're looking to find oil and gas sweet spots, they need to scenario plan. And I think the work of Peter Schwartz then developed the subject of scenario planning. But of course, there are many other industries like the military that need to scenario plan, and financial professionals like ourselves, when looking at particular changes in the market, inflection points, as you mentioned, and what that might mean for the market, for various event risks. On that point, in terms of the subject of scenario planning, but then also the benefit it offers for preparation in addition to prediction. What can you share with us when you speak with your clients and they're looking for the prediction? They're saying, Andy, on which time point will XYZ happen? How much value is there in preparation in addition to prediction? Because a lot of people focus on prediction, they want it to be precise, and sometimes it is, sometimes it's off a little bit, allowing for some deviation. The subject of preparation as part of scenario planning, where do you see the value there?
Right. So this is really all about incremental gains and getting the odds on your side, be it in your personal life, prepping, having enough food in, making sure you've got some degree of backup utility, etc. in extreme cases. But several of my friends, especially in America, are going down that road. Some pretty big players as well there in the markets are doing that over there. So that's that. So what we can do is really, if we look at the question you're asking in terms of financial management, well, it's what are the potential scenarios? Where do we manage the risk? Scenario planning, or we call it situational awareness. The idea of having these cycles. I think one of the areas in the financial markets is about hedging. People tend to hedge on a linear basis when they're trend following, basically trend following ends when probably 2 previous swings are taken out and a good deal of money is given back. That's exactly what's been happening. That's what's been happening in the stock market. So if there's a degree of knowing through cycles and timing where a trend may potentially end in the future in a particular instrument, then the hedging can be optimized. That's certainly something that perhaps we're getting a little bit too specific here for the foundation, but that's one way of planning. I mentioned earlier on, I have a bunch of a solid group of friends around the world. The guys in America, they're preparing on a different level, looking at security for houses and having good food and food supplies, generators, and the ability to fend for themselves quite well with becoming totally self-sufficient. If the world degenerates and we lose everything we take for granted, that's an extreme scenario. So I'm not saying that is going to happen, but we are seeing a degree of polarization, and there will be spots where this will potentially exacerbate and exaggerate.
And in terms of portfolio de-risking, capital preservation, what do you think works in this latest cycle?
That's you're talking to myself as a commodity trader. So I will, whilst we do look at the equity markets, we tend to focus on opportunities that lie ahead across different other instruments. So I don't want to get too specific in terms of what's going on there, but I think what we are seeing is a good degree of geopolitical instability, and that is going to continue. So obviously, if you're looking at the regular stock market, the defense stocks are going to be strong plays, as we mentioned last year to our people, just with the foresight of potential instability that we're seeing. In terms of how is this going to play out, my best bet realistically is here's a nice technique. It's called overlaying. Basically, the Crimean War lasted 27 months, from what I gather. Was it 27 months, or am I confusing this with no, I'm confusing it with the pandemic. The pandemic, the 1987 Spanish flu pandemic lasted 27 months. We overlaid that, and that's why we were able to say that around about March, April would be a key point of the pandemic here. But I think what we need to look at is, I think the Crimean War was the best part of 3 years. So it's potentially going to be 3 years of ongoing stuff going on with the Ukraine and Russia. But everything's different. That if you don't know where to start, look at an overlay, because this is where history does repeat or rhyme. It's not always going to be the same. I mean, the special operation that Putin's engaged in could be over within weeks, days, whatever. He's already made significant gains there, and he's got some of the land back that he wants. So it's difficult to say how these things play out without doing very in-depth cycles and micro cycle analysis. So you can start with a super macro cycle, hundreds of years, go down to a 10-year cycle, then a weekly cycle, and even daily cycles. And that's how we managed to pinpoint the date of the 24th, of February, which was the date of the incursion, which our followers were able to, they were forewarned about and were able to act accordingly on. And of course, there was a huge spike in oil. So that's how we relate these things from geopolitical event into market activity.
And to wrap up our marathon interview, where we've discussed different areas of cycles in terms of a review of what was presented at the summit January past, geopolitical focus, what has come to pass in terms of the pandemic normalization, in terms of Ukraine, Russia, but then the disruption war cycles that we're currently in the eye of the storm on, with more to come. We spoke about the philosophy of cycles and the different stages of it. The big macro disruptive cycle that you have spoken to us about and alerted us on ahead of time. Andy, when is the light at the end of the tunnel where things start to stabilize and reset?
Okay, well, that's a very subjective question. So let me answer that first of all in markets. As we mentioned earlier in this, today is the 90-year anniversary of the low after the 29 crash. So that was a 3-year move down, wasn't it? Really, a 2.5-year move down. So it might well be, but also the 60-year cycle, the 1962 pattern, market-wise made a low. Sorry, let me get. I'm sorry, I've got this the wrong way around. Today's the 60-year low anniversary, but the 90-year low comes in the first week of July, July the 8th. Sorry, I got those confused. So in terms of markets, there might be some sort of relief rally now. Is it going to lead to a new high? Probably not. I think we're due for a bit of a bear market. So in the short term, there's a bit of relief there. In terms of the geopolitical situation, I think that's going to continue for a little while. So, this is really all about mindset and controlling your own mind to be able to deal with and cope with the lifestyle that's going on around you. And just remember, you can only, just remember there's only so much you can influence. So if you're going to watch the news and look at bad news all the time, that is going to disrupt your consciousness. So remember cycles, there are cycles in consciousness as well. As the Vedic system discussed, the Indian philosophy of the Vedas, of the principles of life, and so on, discusses these ideas of consciousness, as does Christianity and Judaism, and all the religions discuss this in the more veiled side of things. So it's about mindset. You have the mindset to control what input you put into your head. If you understand cycles, then you get a degree of clarity with your night vision goggles and your map. Remember, you do have free will to step on the mine. We talked about the minefield, but it's more important to use that free will to stay focused along the path that you wish to continue on. So I think that's probably the right way of doing it.
Very good guidance and an uplifting message there, Andy. If I can ask, just before we wrap on a wonderful interview, what words can you share on the foundation study of cycles, the work that we do, and reasons for members to continue to support, or for people to just be interested in cycles?
Sure, that's a great question. So first of all, big shout out to Dr. Richard Smith, who's put a lot of his own resources into getting the FSC up and going again over the last 2-3 years, and the fellow board members. We're all volunteers, and what we want to do is get this knowledge out there to make the world a better place. So whilst we do a lot of work on markets, we also look at geopolitics, as you know, and anything else. Ray down in New Zealand, Ray Tomes, is an expert on weather cycles, all sorts of cycles. So this knowledge brings empowerment to all of us. And if we can get this to the right people, first of all, self-empowerment's the first thing. So you're watching this because you're interested. Good for you. If we can then spread the word, hopefully we can make society a better place. We might not necessarily be able to avoid the pitfalls and wars, etc., and the challenges and the bear markets, but we'll be able to live through them better and therefore reduce the magnitude of their effects. So that's what I would say. Come and support the foundation. I say it's all voluntary, but we do have staff that need paying. We do want to expand and do more research. So any donations, contributions are all gratefully accepted. Come and join up. You get access to the app that board member Lars von Tienen has done an awful lot of amazing work on. That's very, very effective for not just market forecasting, but any data sets you put in there. We're very enthusiastic about it. So we just want, tell your friends to come on board and support the FSC. Remember, it was started by the US government, by the presidency, to see if we could, make the world a better place. And that's what we aim to do.
Thank you. Well said, and a wonderful enthusiasm there that is being shared out to everyone that is watching. Thank you so much, Andy.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ron. I've got to run. So great to speak to you. Take care.